Jesse, are you watching the Rings of Power?
I have watched the first 3 episodes of The Rings of Power.
Oh, okay. Well, I can't make my joke then.
You can. I don't care about spoilers.
It's just not going to make sense. You're not going to think it's funny.
Okay.
All right, here it is. Okay. Here's my one big problem with the Rings of Power. Okay.
Right.
Get ready, internet. What is their obsession with having Elendil grab women by the face? Like, I don't understand it. It's like the production team was like, look, dude, we put a lot of time and effort into the makeup on your hands to really show off how fucking big your thumbnails are. So I want you to aggressively grab every female character you can by the face to prove how much you care about them. It's really unsettling. Hot take.
Okay. Yeah, I don't get it.
I told you.
So now I feel like the average listener of our podcast.
Bullshit. Bull fucking shit. This podcast has around 300 regular monthly subscribers. And
Really?
that means something's working, god damn it.
We're up to 300?
Yeah.
That's
just
fantastic.
barely. We're getting there, slowly but surely. We're getting there.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those listeners are going to be asking us things, right? Because it is now officially, can I say it?
Yeah, you can say it. Are you going to do the intro?
Why do we need an intro? I thought we're just going to have banter.
Oh, I don't know.
I thought we'd banter the whole time.
Oh, why not?
Okay. Hi, you're listening to the Jaunty Mantis, a question creative podcast. I'm good at this. You do the intro.
You're killing it. Keep going.
A podcast about tabletop role-playing games where we like to talk about creative questions from curious gamers. And you are now in season 4, Listener Questions.
Yeah, that's right. We thought we would go to our gamer audience and say, hey, gamer audience, do you have any questions for us?
And luckily, some people did.
Yes. Yes, some people did. And so we are going to devote the whole season, all 12 episodes, to answering your questions. So, Jesse, we have our first question from a listener.
Yes.
Listener that goes by the name of Jenny.
Hi, Jenny. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, and this was kind of came through in 2 different parts, so we're going to merge those 2 parts together, which was basically, do you have any recommendations for new GMs or new-ish GMs to that are, recommendations for books and or mechanics?
Okay. Well, I'll go first. It's weird. Sorry, listeners. It's weird to be back in like the format of regular shows and not bonus
Stop
episodes.
apologizing. They're getting this for free.
We did a lot of bonus episodes, so to be in a format. So I think overall what I'd be looking for someone who's going to GM for the first time, to me, teachability is probably the most important factor.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's pretty likely if someone's running a game for the first time, they're going to have to teach people how to play it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, mechanic simplicity is great for them to learn it, but I think the teachability is probably really, really important. And so what I would recommend for someone who's a first-time GM or new to GMing and wanting to do it is I'm going to actually, surprisingly, for those who are regular listeners, going to recommend something from the OSR.
Oh, wow.
I know. Who'd have thunk it? I'd start and say my first pick is Old School Essentials, which is one of those games that basically tries to emulate the Dungeons and Dragons basic and expert rules that I think came out in the early 80s, late 70s. Before they're not advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It's very much got this design philosophy of rulings, not rules. It has all the basic character classes. It's got some simple monsters, and there's just not a ton of complexity. Yeah, so I think one of the reasons I would recommend School Essentials is that it's really easy to teach, and also that OSR ethos of rulings, not rules, I think is a really helpful thing to build up GM chops.
Okay, how so?
Like if you can just make a ruling on the fly, if that's your habit, then you're not going to pause your game or slow your game down to go look something up. You're not going to feel that you're doing it wrong. You're just going to feel that you have the agency to do that. And that's something that I think in my personal gaming history, I had that from being a teenager and running games. And then when we got into 3.5, where there was a rule for everything, you know how I like mechanics. So like
Mm-hmm.
I would default to that. And I think we've talked about on the show, like the whole purpose of the Rifts project was to me to get back out of that. So
Right.
if you're a first time GM, like just starting out, I'd say start with one where you don't have a rule for everything, where you have to rule off what makes sense in the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I understand where you're coming from. I did not gain that growing up in the hobby. I got that what you're describing as an adult and having to deal with rules lawyers and
I'm sorry, I can't help it. I'm
you're
just the
one
way
of
the
them.
Lord made me, sir.
But 3.5 is the system that kind of broke me out of the habit because there was a rule for everything and it was kind of obnoxious and there wasn't a lot of creative breath you could take when you ran a game. If somebody at your table, like Jesse, was constantly being like, well, that's not actually how that works. And that would never happen. And like, it kind of just broke me out of that mold. I was slavish to the rules as a GM. I was like, well, if it's in the book, we have to go by what's in the book. And it wasn't until much later on in my gaming career, so to speak, that I was able to break out of that. So I get what you're saying, and I think it's important because it's a game of creativity. And at the heart of Dungeons and Dragons, if you go back far enough, it was a game where they were like, the rule you set at your table is the rule you should stay with.
Yeah.
The book is not a Bible. It's not a a sacred tome of rules that cannot be bent, or removed. And I think that's an important skill to learn as a GM. Is when is it okay for you to go into the margins or stretch things out or throw things out? And then the answer is whenever you want. you know.
And that's a
Uh
really, really good lesson for new GMs, game masters, DMs, storytellers, whatever you want to call it. See, me personally, I wish this was my joke. I just heard it on a podcast and I say it about myself is I'm the kind of rules follower that if I got stuck at a broken stoplight in a car in the desert, I would die in that car. Like with middle of nowhere, no one else around, four-way stop at the stoplight is broken on red. I'm dying in that car. So to me, like if the rules in the book, you might as well take the time to learn it because people worked really hard on it and you don't want them to be disappointed. This is my Hoosier brain, the way it works.
yeah. Hmm.
And so I just then to get out of that go towards systems where they don't have a rule written for it. But if you're not like, broken like me by
Hmm.
order and law and rules, then yeah, start with something like Old School Essentials. It's 2 books is what you need to do it. And it also has a pretty cool range of little adventure modules built for it that do some real weird OSR stuff that could get you some good ideas for what to do in your own game to make it weird.
I mean, by its very nature, if I'm remember Old School Essentials accurately, even by its nature, it gives you a format in which things are about to get weird and could get out of control. Like correct me if I'm wrong, but as a spellcaster, you have to make a roll to cast a spell, and if you don't succeed, horrible things start happening.
That's DCC.
Ah, Dungeon Crawl Classics. I got
Yes.
you. Okay.
Dungeon Crawl Classics is I don't know if I would recommend that one for a first time player. There's some cultural references that I think it's making that if you're new to it, maybe you're not going to pick up because that one Like the rules of old school essentials are designed to be a streamlined version of basics or BX, like that makes sense and is like tightly designed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Dungeon Crawl Classics is designed to capture the conceptual feel of adventuring back then, but not necessarily the rules, because they have like the weird D16 dice and all this other stuff you need to pick up for that game. So,
Gotcha.
yeah, a
Gotcha.
little different. How about you? What would you recommend as your first pick?
I would recommend, big shocker here, Dungeon World. Jesse and I both cite Dungeon World as part of our leveling up process as game masters, and the reason why is uh, it really does bring up the, in my opinion, what are the most important aspects of running games. Playing to, see what happens, or play to find out what happens. The way that the dice system works when you try to resolve risks and conflicts or whatever. And the way it teaches you to be improvisational as a game master, the way it shows you how to use your players and the group as a whole as a writer's room, as we've discussed in the past. And if you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, you're going to be familiar with all the essential components that this game is working with. All of those, fighter and thief and wizard, all the stuff is basically there. It uses a lot of the same language that we all come to understand from Dungeons and Dragons, but it's just presenting it to you in a much different format that gets you to, think more creatively about how you want to run games and also how you want to prep for games.
Yeah, and the mechanics are pretty elegant. It's a 2d6 roll with a little table where 10 or higher is you do it, 7 to 9 is success with a complication, and below that you didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, my question, I have a question for you on that. Do you think if someone is new GM, and I know it may be very hard to imagine a world where no one has any knowledge of the trappings of D&D, but do you think that Dungeon World works if you're not kind of already in the hobby? Like, if is there enough cultural osmosis of the mythos? Why do I talk like this at this time?
Mm-hmm.
That someone could pick it up as like someone brand new to it and just go?
I've asked myself that question many a time, but in the context of like getting new people who have never played a role-playing game, I've done that with Dungeon World. Like if you're interested in role-playing games as a hobby and the first thing you pick up is Dungeon World, will it have the same effect? I don't know. But if you have an experienced GM and there are people in your life who are like, "Hey, you play Dungeons and Dragons. Is that fun? Can we try that?" And you're like, "Yeah, sure." And you open up Dungeon World instead, I have seen that go over very well with people. The rolling of the 2d6, and you're either getting a success with a consequence, or a failure. That creates these circumstantial moments that allow people to have a lot of creativity, and using the, well, what do you think would happen, or what does this look like to you, or just immediately engaging your players. I've seen people respond to that very well who have no experience with D&D at all. So I think it's a big mystery to me whether somebody who's like, "Oh, I want to get into this hobby," and maybe they accidentally picked up Dungeon World instead of Dungeons and Dragons. I have no idea how that would work out. Is your point like that there's Dungeon World rests too much on the legacy of Dungeons and Dragons?
Well, this is just something that like I think about most of the like powered by the apocalypse games is that they're really great engines for telling stories within a genre.
Mm-hmm.
But in order for that to really be effective, you kind of have to be aware of the common tropes or aspects of that genre.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Like, what does discern realities mean to somebody who's never like done this before?
Yeah. So discern realities is basically the lore or knowledge check equivalent in Dungeon World. And it's done in a way that I think what you're getting at is you can only really truly appreciate it if you've been frustrated by the same kind of checks in Dungeons and Dragons, or at least you're familiar with them, if not frustrated with them. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say you could only enjoy it, but I feel like it's very strongly a text that's in conversation with what came before. And
Mm-hmm.
that's part of the reason it works so well for us is it's a really interesting side of that conversation, but we can hear the other half that
Yeah.
it's talking to.
Yeah.
Mechanically, I definitely agree. The mechanics are so straightforward and so simple. I think anybody new could pick it up and get the mechanics of the game. I just want to know if you think that like their experience might be impacted. I'm not saying you're wrong.
Well, okay. So for the basis of this conversation, based on Jenny's question, I took this to mean like a new-ish GM is someone who has started playing Dungeons and Dragons 5e and is looking for a little bit more in mechanics or other systems that might help them run their game better, or even give them different games to try out with their groups, in order to, kind of, improve their repertoire, so to speak. That's how I took it. I
Oh, and
think this
that
is
it's
a
perfect. Yeah, it's perfect
yeah.
in that
I
way.
mean, I think it's a very interesting question that you're posing, because so much of the love language that is in Dungeon World is Dungeons and Dragons, if that makes sense. Like Dungeon World would be saying, my love language is Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
That's its message. It's just that Sage Latora and Adam Coble, who created it, definitely delve deep into like what is playing a role-playing game, and how does the Power by the Apocalypse system facilitate that. Like Discern Realities gives you information as from GM to player. It's like, I'm going to give you a number of pieces of information based on what you rolled, and it's up to you to figure out how they're useful, which is an amazing way to handle a knowledge check or a lore check otherwise. Like in D&D 5e or 3rd edition or 4th edition, it's like you have to roll to meet a DC to see if your character knows something.
Yep.
These are two totally different ways of basically doing the same thing. It's just that the Dungeon World version just makes more sense with the essence of play, right? Like, if you really think about it, when it comes to a knowledge check, why would you want to restrict valuable information about your campaign and your adventure from your players? So why would they be required to roll to see if they know anything, right? And that's kind of what Discern Realities addresses, is like, hey, you're going to get information no matter what. And it's just up to you in order to make it useful, which is that bid that the game master is passing to the player and saying, like, this is a shared storytelling experience. The game master in a Dungeon World game is less referee and more just like the story facilitator of the group, of that group storytelling. And that's what I think, that those are lessons that I use today, in the current game that I'm running for you guys in the 1 to 20 project that I have going on. And we're playing D&D 5e. I am using the tools from Dungeon World. I am actively passing those seeds, or the torch, over to you guys as players. And then I'm basically just muting my mic, because we play over Zoom, and letting you guys run with it. And as a great group of nerds who are, I feel I trust to be able to do that, it's been nothing but just wonderful role play and story opportunities that I think has been mutually beneficial. But how, outside of maybe the new book that I haven't read, the 2024 version, I have like, before the Dungeon World book, I had never seen another game actively address that aspect as it related to Dungeons and Dragons specifically.
Yeah,
So,
it's one of those things that I think there's so many default assumptions of coming at the way you play the game with a knowledge check like that, that it's something that's really hard to answer when there's other parts of the book that maybe need to be right next to that in like classic Dungeons and Dragons that are like,
mm-hmm.
don't roll unless it's mechanically interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Like if someone says, "Do I know this?" Well, you're a wizard. Yes, you know this. Like unless it's mechanically interesting to have a chance of success or failure.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how often is it mechanically interesting to the story to just, nope, you don't know anything about it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I would also add for Dungeon World that it uses the mechanical elements, really the only ones that actually matter when you think about it, because it's not trying to be a chunky game system. It's not trying to be Dungeons and Dragons. It's trying to be its own thing. And the best example I have for this is we talked about the Ranger class in in one of our previous episodes, and Rangers get animal companions. Dungeon World is a game where somebody can be like, "Hey, uh, bees are my animal companion," and the game master's like, "Cool, how does that work?" And they're like, I have a honeycomb that I carry around on my back, and I have a connection to the bees. And when I tell them to go do stuff, they go do it." And it's like the base dice mechanics that are needed for an animal companion are basically the same, regardless of whatever your animal companion could be. And I'm not saying you can't do something imaginative like that in D&D. You totally can. It's just in Dungeon World, it's like that seems to just work so much better because it's not using a complex rule system. It's using just enough.
Cool.
Okay. Anything else about Dungeon World before we go to your second?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay. So your second.
I was gonna say Shadow Dark is what I would recommend, and there's a couple reasons why. You can literally, like, without even using a shadowdarkling.net, the character generator, which reduces character generation to about 5 seconds of work. You can make a character, and I know this from experience, with people who have never played before in 5 minutes. You've got the character sheet filled out. You can start to explain what the things mean. It's not overwhelming. You can do it in 5 minutes. And the way that it does this is another thing that I think is really, really helpful for building your GM chops. It does it through stuff being random. It's a random attribute generator. Like, you can roll randomly for your race. You can roll or your kin. You can roll randomly for your class. When you level up, you roll randomly for what talent you get that makes your character mechanically better in some way appropriate to your character class. I think just as a game that's teachable, and again, also reinforces that lesson of rulings, not rules. I think Shadow Dark is pretty great. Also modern sensibility, and it's a cool looking book.
Yeah, it is a gorgeous book.
And it's chock full of tables. Like, it is literally everything you need to play. It is a story generator. It is a monster manual. It is a rules tome. Well, the rules are very short because there's not a ton. Like everything you need to run everything from a one-shot adventure and make it to a full campaign is kind of in that book.
Yeah. We did a whole episode on Shadow Dark, and I kind of had to be drug over the finish line with Shadow Dark, but I did get there. It was never a question of, is this a good game? Is this a cool game? It totally is. That was never in question. I just didn't really get it at first until I realized my aha moment was how simple and elegant Shadow Dark is as a game. It's just getting right to the point. It's just focusing on the things that are most important, and it's very adjacent to at least 2014 D&D. That it's taking those elements and it's kind of just like removing the unnecessary parts and just like getting right to the game. And then it's replacing those parts with like the rules for the torch, for instance.
Yeah, that's the other thing, is just having one little rule on scarcity is something that I think can teach you as a newish GM to like remind that sometimes a limit or a timer puts a pressure on the players to act in ways that drive the story forward, which is what we're all here for at the end of the day, to kind of tell a story in some way. So I just think it's great. I don't know that I actually have a lot to expand on Shadow Dark as my second pick. I just think I wish that would have been my first game I ran. I don't know.
I think Shadow Dark is also an important lesson in keeping it simple. I think if you're listener, if you're a new GM, or if you're a GM like me, you have a tendency to kind of overcomplicate the hell out of everything that you want to put into a game. And Shadow Dark, after reading that book, I have found that I am a more efficient game master essentially. Like, and that's kind of what Shadow Dark can do for you, is like remind you to keep it simple. If you do have to make a ruling, in the moment, and you will, remember, keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it. It's a very important part of what the overall message of that book, I think, is trying to tell you.
It's also a master class in keeping it moving.
Mm-hmm.
Both as a PC because of the timer on the torches, and as a GM because one of the things it has you do is it just has you start like do things in initiative order in your regular turn, not just in combat. Start with a player on your left. What are you doing? Okay, what are you doing? And then you go around the table. I have this work game we play on our lunch break. We have basically 50 minutes to play.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I will have 12 or 13 people show up.
Oh, wow.
And everybody gets to do something twice.
Nice.
And everybody's watching, like twice around the table.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing to me. And it's the way Shadow Dark's written and what it told me to do that's making that happen.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as like pacing, like, man, that's the thing I take from Shadow Dark.
Right on. Right on. And you want to talk about a masterclass? Let's get to my second pick, which is a book that you recommended to me one day, and I will be forever grateful. It is Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master by Sly Flourish. This is, as far as I'm concerned, this should be your DM's guide.
Yeah, we're both there. This one, not mechanics pick, but how to GM pick.
Yes. And I would be remiss if this did not get mentioned in this episode, as far as like good books or games or mechanics that are an asset to you as a game master. I've been using it ever since Jesse introduced me to it. It tells you, it gives you an order and how to prep for a game. It stresses the importance of all of these different things, like make sure you have a strong start, make sure you have an idea of who your NPCs are,
make sure you've reviewed the characters and what their skills are, because that's what they want to do in the game.
Right. And make sure that you have a set of fantastic locations ready to go. When you're designing your NPCs, try and model them after characters in popular culture or fiction, movies, books, comic books. And here's a little tweak you can do, a couple of tweaks you can do to make them just different enough at the table. And really, the Lazy Dungeon Master is kind of, that's the only thing I don't like about the book, because you're not being lazy. You're just Mike Shea, who is Sly Flourish, figured out like the optimal way to prep for a game. And the whole book is he's like, do the following things. Anything you didn't use, toss them out. You're going to do this again every single session, before every single session. And it gives you just a great list of how to review your notes and get ready for a game. I do it before every game I run. I do his process, and it is amazing. I make sure I have a strong start. I make sure I've reviewed the characters, and I make sure I have stuff in the game for them to do. I make sure I have a set of new fantastic locations for them to either find on purpose or find by accident. I have the important NPCs for them to talk to. I have everything all done. And we're not writing like vast tomes. We're doing like one line or a few tags or a couple of sentences about each thing you want to do. And if this is the essential book, in my opinion, for any GM. I wish I had this book when I first started running games. This would have been a huge help. So I cannot stress this game enough. Or I'm sorry, this book enough.
I will say that too. This is a really great prep book for people that are like willing to go a little bit more on an improvisational style. Mm-hmm. Because one of the key things that you do for actually driving the story is you pick like 10 secrets that could be learned by the PCs. You want to throw out an example of a secret, Maddie?
Do I want to throw out an example of a secret?
Yeah, I'm fishing for hints about what's happening in our next D&D game. Ignore me, audience.
So in our current game that I'm running for them, one of the secrets is that the apothecary in this town that they're in, this small, lazy, out of the way town, is actually part of a network of secret keepers and lore masters, and they don't know each other's names. They don't know who each other are, but they will get in contact with each other and trade information. And this NPC has inadvertently gotten involved in the plots of the story. And that is a secret that I put into the game for the player characters to find.
Yep. And I uncovered that one with an insight check that I like used a resource to get advantage on, because I was like, oh, an insight check about this guy. I wonder what it could be. And it was that cool secret that was revealed. Secrets in that concept can be something as simple as like goblins are patrolling the forest. I mean, like, one of the things I'll tell you, if you're thinking this, like, oh, I don't want to think of all these complicated secrets, which was my initial reaction when I first read it, is it's just a secret is just something the PCs don't know yet. Like that they could stumble across during the course of a play session. It doesn't have to be like a conspiracy.
Right.
Like it could be literally like the farmer's daughter loves the stable boy. Like that's just a thing the PCs don't know.
Right.
And so you get those up. It's so great for improvisational style, and you will not reveal every secret.
Right. And the ones you don't use, what do you do with them? You discard them and you come up with some new ones.
I cheat and just save them for next time.
Well, I mean, I guess you could just save the really good ones, right? Or
Yeah,
the
I
ones
save
that
the
you
good
feel
ones.
very strong about. But another example of a secret and clue in the current game is there's these two young hooligans in the town who are causing trouble, and everybody thinks they're responsible for every wrong thing that has ever happened in this town over the last like 2 years. Okay. And it's a very general secret that could mean almost anything, but it's something that's always in play. That's one I keep holding on to every session that we've run, because the every time the plot elements show up in this game, one of the NPCs will say, you know what? It's probably these two. They're always up to no good. Everybody blames them for everything.
And that's why we don't suspect them at all. I will say too, another thing that's great about this as a resource is that so much of it is made freely available online. Like there are like digital tools have you seen the Notion template?
No.
They're like she's publicly shared a Notion template that's like literally like a checkbox you could fill out of like on Notion pages, which is like your own personal wiki of just the campaign, the steps to follow to create new pages that are linked to each other and have all your campaign notes. Like half of my campaigns are in the Notion thing based off that template.
Oh, cool.
He also has a podcast where he uses this methodology
so you can just
prep
hear him do
his games.
Yes.
And one of the more recent ones was a Shadow Dark game based on like the hex crawl in the first Shadow Dark zine. So like it's great as a resource to hear the person who invented this system actually using it.
Right.
And yeah, it's really great to help you have like a framework that makes improvisation not terrifying.
Right. And it's also a great way to give yourself enough work to do so that you can feel satisfied and ready to run your game. Like we just did we play on Sunday nights. We record the Jaunty Mantis on Monday nights. So the game that I had last night, I got to be honest with you, when we fired up Zoom, I was like, crap, I am not ready for this game. I do not feel ready for this game. You know, I had taken a nap. I had just woken up. I was kind of out of my element. I'm like, fuck, I'm not ready. I start looking over my notes, looking over the system as Sly Flourish is laid out for me in that book. And I'm like, oh yeah, I know what's happening. It's all here right in front of me. The fucking system works.
I just looked one up from an old campaign, just for example. So I had some scenes and I just wrote, this was from a Rifts game, the first Rifts game. Scenes are confronting the necromancer, The Pit of Corum, the thing you all decided not to go to.
Uh-huh.
The Heart of the Pit, Secrets and Clues, Cletus the Dark is a Soul Reaper, Cletus's travel companions are zombies, Broadkill guard the Pit of Corum, a treasure of the ancient days lies in the heart of the pit, the pony tribe of Psystalkers haunt the ruins of Denapolis, and a giant wanders the woods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just enough information to have something go on with just enough little bit of a treat for something to grow out of into an encounter or a role play opportunity in the game. Like I have done the prep for my games using this system, and then when they come up in the game, the players have taken them off in different directions that I had never planned for. And that's why I subscribe to the method of plan and then toss the things that you don't use, because you want to start with a new fresh set of tools. Jesse does it a different way. He holds on to the ones he really likes. I think there's no wrong answer here. Get this fucking book.
Yeah, well, that's Kevin Crawford. Don't throw away something that you made but didn't use. Just reuse it. That's where that instinct comes from. But he's not on my new player list.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh. Oh. Interesting.
So that would okay. So what is your third and final book?
My third and final is also another how-to guide, and this is the opposite end of the spectrum. And this one is called So You Want to Be a Dungeon Master by Justin Alexander of the Alexandrian.net, who is another, he's not, I think, as well known. He's got a kind of older school vibe than Sly Flourish, but like, if you want a practical how-to, like scaffolded, like these are the steps for adventure design, or these are the steps for the dungeon design, and then here are the twists you can put into it. Like, I think that is a book to go to. And I was actually listening to it I had an extra Audible credit, so I was listening to it on Audible, and like, for a how-to book, this is working pretty well as an audiobook. One of the things that like I just think about for like dungeon design that I got from this book, like if you are creating a dungeon for Dungeons and Dragons, and you might do that if you're playing a fantasy role-playing game, is you like had like 5 types of rooms, or like the 4+1, you have like a treasure room, an obstacle room, a twist room, a combat room, and a challenge room. And so the basic dungeon template for a simple dungeon for your map is pick 4 of the kinds and then double up 1 as a twist. And you could do that all day if you just pick different ones, and you'd never have the same dungeon twice.
Beautiful.
And it's got great illustrative examples of doing that in each one. And then as he goes through the book, he takes it more complicated. He was really influenced by Janelle Jacquet, who did the Dark Tower. Not the board game that you love, but the classic adventure module, which has that whole idea of like multiple entrances in a dungeon and like 3 factions to play off each other. So the balance of power changes as the PCs are down there doing stuff. So it feels like a real living world. And basically, like she was the first one to elevate a dungeon to be more just a series of room where you go and fight monster, grab treasure. She made it a story instead of Hero Quest.
Okay.
And he's heavily influenced by her and has like taken a lot of those techniques, and they're in that book. So I would highly, highly recommend that book, or just reading his blog.
Awesome. I haven't read any of that. I'll have to check it out. So
it's way more systematic than like I know Mike Shea has a system, but like this is like step-by-step system, and in each one there's an example of creation using that tool at the end of the chapter. And then he expands it like, well, here's how this plot structure works if you're doing a mystery. Here's how this works if you're doing intrigue. And it's
awesome.
It's a pretty great resource.
Yeah, fantastic.
How about you?
Cool.
What's your third?
I have a third, and I also have an honorable mention.
Okay.
My third is a book we talked about in season 3 called Index Card RPG. I was blown away by this book when we reviewed it I have been using so many things from this book currently in my D&D 5e game. So Index Card RPG, if you didn't listen to the episode, is a separate role-playing game into its own, that has like a lot of really cool, well thought out, just genius level ideas for how to handle certain kinds of mechanics to help flesh them out or make them more interesting. And one of the best examples that I can give right now is the three T's, right? The threat. For every encounter, you should have the three T's in mind: a threat, a timer, and a treat, or treats, multiple treats. And I have been doing that for every encounter that I have designed. A threat is simple and straightforward. Establish what the threat is, the monster you choose, or the traps, or whatever, how the scene works. The timer, you set a timer for the encounter, and then you let the player characters know what that timer is. In X number of rounds, the following things will happen. And then treats are things that you've put into the encounter to either power them up during the encounter or to help them bypass the threat. And it's a really cool way to kind of bring an encounter all together, because the way that I was running encounters before this in Dungeons and Dragons specifically was I'd choose a monster, I'd run an encounter, we'll see what happens. And this brings more organization to the chaos, and I think creates a better overall product for your encounters. So, for example, in the 1 to 20 game, the first session that I ran for Jesse and the rest of our players, we had an encounter, a combat encounter, where these mutated forest creatures were coming out of the woods. And I said to the player characters, okay, in 3 or 4 rounds, I think it was 4 actually, in 4 rounds, these creatures are going to make their way through the caravan and they are going to kill all of the travelers. So it sets the circumstances for the encounters. You have 4 rounds to solve this problem, either kill all the creatures or find a way to get rid of them. And then I put a treat into the encounter, and it happens as soon as the encounter starts. A horse gets spooked, knocks over the wagon that it's pulling, which causes a cascade of other things to fall over and creates a uniquely defensible position that the player characters should use. They should direct the NPCs to the defensible position, which I didn't tell them to do. They figured it out on their own. And then also, when they defended the travelers from attacks, whatever attacks they made against these creatures had advantage. So I was sweetening the combat scenario by showing them, where the treat was in it. And it worked really, really, really well.
And you forgot the third incidental treat.
Oh, which was?
Describe what horrible amalgam of mutated, twisted animals the thing you're attacking is.
Yes. Yeah.
So that was fun for me.
Excellent. Some other great things that Index Card RPG has is it has a index card system. You can either buy this separately, which I did not, or you can just do the homemade version, which is the version I do, which is you can set up an easy to use deck. Because I don't play in person, I play over Zoom. So I have created like a deck of index cards and just written these locations on them. So like blacksmith, apothecary, stables, like all of these things in a town, like a prison, a chapel, all of these things. And then, okay, you're in the town. To the north is the following things, and you're like the forge, the chapel. You just go through them. Like if you could do this for rooms in a dungeon. You can set up an encounter with it using the actual cards themselves if you want to buy them. I would, if I had an in-person game, I would totally be using this, but I do it over Zoom, so it doesn't really matter. But the Index Card RPG is full of really cool mechanics like this. One of the ones that we mentioned in our season 3 episode was it has a hit point adjacent version for doing non-combat encounters with the heart system. So you have a difficulty assessed to like, getting into a room or climbing a perilous tower or whatever the normal skill scenarios you would have in a Dungeons and Dragons game. And you can assign a certain number of hearts and then a certain number of successes on the player's parts, take down those hearts as if they were hit points of the encounter, which just adds, in my opinion, more of a richness and versatility to what you're doing instead of just like, well, I rolled, did I open the lock or not? Like it just makes it so much more rich and viable for the play experience.
Yep. And the room thing,
Yeah.
like the encounter, like this is a one type of room. There's a whole series of drawings of different rooms that like an encounter could happen in. That's like, in this one, the walls are sticky. And in this one, like it's just little elements to spice up the area where an encounter is happening. That's super cool. I have an honorable mention real quick
Go for it.
that
Yeah.
I could talk more about because again, we did this one in season 2. It's just one piece of it, or season 3, one piece of advice from
Mm-hmm.
Trophy that I would recommend to all new GMs. And the timer does this. It is totally okay to telegraph what the point of the scene is
Mm-hmm.
to the PCs. In this scene, the goal is to find what this guy's really up to. It is fine to say that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to ruin anybody's time.
Right. Right. There's this aspect to games where we as GMs think we have it all planned out in our heads and that we're communicating it very easily and clearly. And a lot of the times our players are not picking up on what we're trying to tell them. And it is totally okay to just come out and say to them, hey, this is what's supposed to be happening in this, this is the point of this scene. This is where I would like you to focus. It is totally okay to do that as a
Yep.
GM. So
And,
honorable mention for you is Trophy Dark.
Yeah. I wouldn't, not for new GM. Don't do Trophy Dark. Do Trophy Gold, and pick up Trophy Loom for tables. As a new GM getting your feet under you, please don't run. Please don't run Trophy Dark for new players. You're gonna scare them away.
I got excited about this thing called a role-playing game. It's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons. It's called Trophy Dark. It says it's a death spiral role-playing game. This ought to be fun.
We so yeah, just that piece of advice is my honorable mention from Trophy.
Mm-hmm.
Any real quick, any ones that any games or anything? I know I'm more likely to have an answer for this than you are, but any games that you love, but you would not recommend for somebody who's new, or I would never not recommend something to steal ideas from. But like
is there a game that I love, but I would not recommend it?
For like a new GM, someone just getting their feet under them.
Yeah.
Ignoring the other half of the question, we're like, what are mechanics you can take from other games? Because again,
right. Yeah. I don't have the vast library that you do. I haven't played in as many games as you do, or read as many books that you have. So I don't know if I can directly answer that outside of like Shadowrun, unless like Shadowrun Anarchy is a game I cannot wait to play. But original recipe Shadowrun is such a fucking game, and I love it. There's a part of me that like just some of my favorite gaming moments are in Shadowrun, but Jesus Christ, I would not recommend that to a brand new GM or a new-ish GM. There's too many moving parts, It's just it's a fucking cool game, and if once you've become a seasoned game master in something like D&D, check out Shadowrun. It's fucking awesome. But like to a new GM, absolutely not. Stay away from Shadowrun.
everything he just said, except replace the word Shadowrun with Exalted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exalted
same
is
thing.
so cool.
Love it to death. So cool. Such a neat setting and universe. And the way the mechanics work to do it are really cool, but they are a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Especially if you love anime, Exalted is a fucking awesome game for you then.
I will also add if you love Journey to the West and if you love the Odyssey and the Iliad.
Yes.
If you're in the Venn diagram where those three things are cool to you, Exalted is the game for you.
Right. For sure. My honorable mention is another book that Jesse turned me onto. It is not a game in itself. It is a book that is called The Monsters Know What They're Doing.
Oh, now you're just being mean.
I I absolutely love this book. I have it on audiobook, and I don't know how relevant it's going to be for uh D&D 2024 Monster Manual. I don't know how much is being changed, but basically the author of this book, The Monsters Know What They're Doing, has studied the monsters in the 5th edition Monster Manual and then just kind of taken them apart for their base elements and then just tells you what their strengths and weaknesses are and then uses those mechanics to tell you how they are supposed to perform in a fight. And can be with like lethal efficiency.
And it's yeah, and it's really like one, I think you should do it if you're a fan of D&D 5th edition 2020 or 2014, because seeing him break down the system, you realize the genius that went into the monster entries. Like he has this whole thing for like, based on their alignment and their stat profile, they're probably going to fall into this category.
Right.
So like he's like, goblins being chaotic evil usually are not great at working together. Every man's out for himself. Kobolds being lawful evil will work in a group and like will sacrifice themselves for the greater good of their community.
Right.
Like, so kobolds will swarm the guy with the torch, all giving each other advantage so one of them can get it and run away and extinguish it. And I'm like, oh, that's good.
Yes.
He's like, you never see goblins you're fighting. They shoot at you from cover individually and then use their bonus thief-like dash actions to move somewhere else and hide again so they can shoot you from hiding. Goblins always fight you from 40 feet away.
Right.
And that makes dinky little goblins like the fodder of first-level dungeons into terrifying ambush predators.
Right. Yeah.
And it's on the entry in the monster manual. And this book points that out.
Yes.
So if you want to challenge your PCs as a DM and have a good time reading it, I second that. I have all 3 of his books.
They're so good. I like I said, I have them on audiobook and I listen to them while I'm like getting dinner ready. Like, if I have an encounter that's going to use a monster specifically from the monster manual and I know that entry is in this book, I listen to this book on audiobook tell me the strategies on how to run these monsters, because yes, these monsters are going to be more lethal and has the potential to really mess up your players and scare them, but when they win those encounters, they are going to be so satisfied with the encounter overall. I cannot describe how amazing it is that somebody reverse engineered monsters as if they were parts of tech, and then basically just tells you how they work and why the work they do. And then here are some interesting things you can do with them. And you're like, oh my God, I'm going to kill the party. It's going to be awesome.
And there's totally a pattern in all those monsters.
Oh, yes.
In the book. Like they all fit into this. I fought those goblins doing that tactic in a game Matty was running, and we had to like try and get above them. We were on this sloping hill boulder field. We had to try and get above them, and then I barbarian rage to try and knock one of the standing stones strewn with their ritual garbage to pull all their cover down so we had a chance to see them and get them before they could kill us all.
Yeah.
It was so cool, the tactics we had to use to try and survive that fight with just goblins.
Right. Right. Yeah. I can't recommend this book enough. It's amazing. I hope there's an analog or translation over to 5e 2024 Monster Manual, whatever that looks like.
I bet the pattern of using like what their high and low stats are and alignment to think of a general type and then just looking at the abilities on the page is gonna still hold true.
Yeah, for sure. This book is an absolute joy just to read, or in my case, listen to. So if you want, as a newish GM, if you're looking to give your encounters more teeth and then make them more fun and interesting, not just for you to run, but also for your players to experience, the monsters know what they're doing. Definitely pick it up.
Cool. We're gonna have the books that we talked about in the show notes.
Yeah. I'll remember to put links to them in the show notes.
Cool.
So what I'd like to do next, Jesse, since we have a little bit of time here, is I would like for us to just kind of maybe lightning round some mechanics, because I know that was another part of the question, is it wasn't just books and the mechanics in those books, but also mechanics that we implore or use in our games that might be helpful, kind of like lessons learned that could be helpful to new-ish GMs.
Okay.
If you're up for it. So I'll start. Okay. And this kind of goes back to an earlier part of the discussion where I said it doesn't make any sense for you to restrict information to your players that would have otherwise been achieved by a knowledge check, right? If there's an important piece of information about this temple and the statue at this temple or this holy symbol, and it really, like, if you think about it, the more information you can give your players that's relevant to the plot as it's unfolding, the better, in my opinion. And why you would covet and keep that secret behind a DC whatever role that they may or may not be able to make, I think is kind of ridiculous. And one of the things that I've learned to do over the years is that anybody who wants to make that knowledge check, I did this with Jesse's character in the 1 to 20 game. It's like they're going to get a piece of information no matter what. And it's going to be the most simple and relevant piece of information that advances the story forward, or at least gives a clue to what's about to happen next. But then I will also come up with additional information that I think is not necessarily essential, but is definitely builds on the role itself. So I'll still use the same D20 roll for a knowledge religion check. And let's say Jesse goes to roll and he gets a 12. He makes the DC, and that's on the lower end. I give him the bare bones of the information so that he has essentially what he's looking for. But if he were to roll even more, I would start giving more and more detail, and I would set a tier system for, if the minimum DC is 10 in order to pass, here's the base information. If they get a 12, here's a little bit more of information. If they get a 15 or 16, here's a little bit of information. If they get a 20 or whatever, here's the whole enchilada. So that is something that I have learned to do over the years instead of restricting information. Jesse, what do you think about that?
I think that's a really, really great piece of advice.
Thank you.
Yeah, because it's basically the fail forward. Nope, you didn't succeed. Stops play.
Right.
Like, it stops play. People don't know where to go. They don't know what to do next. So if it's a bad roll, there's a consequence to not finding this piece out. Fine, whatever. Yeah, that's great advice. I'm going to follow that up and say, it's from the Powered by the Apocalypse game. Ask lots of leading questions. This can be as simple as, if the player rolls badly, you can say, you're a very competent person. How does fate fuck you on this?
Yeah.
Which a thing I don't get to say at my at work game because I'm at work,
Right.
So, or something like, why can't you shake the feeling that you failed even though it seems like a success?
Mm-hmm.
Or just these little character moments. How do you feel? I asked Takar the Hawk, one of my players' characters, I asked, how does Takar feel about the sight of these dead peasants within the boundaries of Solamnia?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm mad. I'm like, well, what are you going to do about it?
Right. Yes.
So just ask these leading questions that tie into backstory, that put people in the emotional space of their characters.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I love that. Yeah. That is something that I need to do more of. Quite frankly, I definitely try to give bids and leads to my players, but specifically saying to a player about their character, how does so-and-so feel about this? What does that evoke in them? Are they okay with what just happened? You are essentially passing that story stick right over to them. And you'll know the players that are good at this at your table, and definitely utilize them to set the tone. But always remember, you have those other players that are just not like Jesse is a perfect example of a player character that I know I can hand that stick to at a moment's notice. You know, I could sneeze and hand the stick over to him and he'd run with it in the game. And fortunately, the rest of my players are very similar in that regard. But I know Jesse is a go-to person like that. So take advantage of that person at your table, but don't forget about the other player characters and use this method. If you notice that one of your player characters is having trouble, taking the spotlight or participating, start specifically going to them. How does your character feel about this? Or what does your character think about this? Get them re-engaged back into the social aspect of Dungeons and Dragons or role-playing games.
Yep.
Okay, I have another mechanic that I might have mentioned before, but inspiration in D&D 5e I think is something that I'm not a huge fan of the way it works, rules as written 2014. I've often wanted to modify it into a whole menu of different options, which you can certainly find online if you search for it. But one of the most effective things I've found with inspiration specifically is letting it be kind of like a little bit of an extra oomph for player characters. The example that I always like to give when I talk about this is Kurt in one of our one-shot games. It was a 5e game. The player characters were going into an underground cellar that had this other part of it, this secret part of it underground, and the door to the cellar had this like immense lock on it, which at the time I made a big deal out of. It doesn't make sense that the cellar door in this guy's house has this huge lock and like bar over it. And so the player characters jimmied it open, went down the stairs, ended up finding that there's like a half ogre down there. And they're like, oh shit, we bit off way more than we could chew, right? So they hightail it out of the cellar. Kurt's character is the last one up the stairs. He uses both of his actions to move so he can get as far away from this thing as possible, which gets him just to the top of the stairs. And he says, I know I used both of my actions to move. Is there any way I can close that door? And I'm like, yeah, sure. And he's like, can I also lock it? And I said, do you have inspiration? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, if you spend your inspiration, I'll let you close and lock that door. And I have become a huge fan of this as an option of having, it's nice to have a reroll, is as the normal part of inspiration. But I like, letting the player characters kind of like fudge a little bit using inspiration.
Yep. That's a good one. I like it. I would say, just to kind of dovetail off that one, a lot of games have added in advantage and disadvantage as a mechanic, that basically if the situation is advantageous to the players, they roll 2 of the die and take the higher. It's not just in 5e. And disadvantage, which is roll that. I would say be pretty liberal with disadvantage as a DM.
Yeah.
And then ask the PCs what they want to do about that, because then they'll start thinking in creative ways that you can reward with advantage. Because I think one of the core assumptions of like modern Dungeons and Dragons, or anything with the advantage disadvantage system in it, which Shadow Dark has advantage disadvantage in it,
right,
is that like, if you can story tell your way into advantage, and you probably
right.
should be trying to as much as humanly possible, because it makes you interact with the story more.
Yeah. Yeah, dude, we could do a whole episode on advantage, disadvantage just on its own, in my opinion. It is one of the most elegantly simple but effective mechanics that I guarantee you the vast majority of nerds out there playing D&D are not using this mechanic, myself included, anywhere close to how it should be. Like, think about what you could do with advantage, disadvantage, right? If you're, let's say there's a combat encounter, all of your player characters have used their attacks, and then it's the monster's turn and things have gone south, right? The MacGuffin got knocked out of somebody's hands. It's about to go over the edge. And one of your player characters is like, is there any way I can just reach forward and grab it? You can say, oh, you can totally do that. Make a dexterity acrobatics roll to see if you get it. But by the way, on your next turn, regardless of what you do, you're going to have disadvantage as a result. Like, it's such a creative enabler that I'm surprised that we're not using to its absolute fullest.
Shadow Dark has got me doing it more.
Perfect.
Because just like ruling's not rules, it's a little bit freer. I was just thinking too, like just a combat example, right? The area where if we fight outdoor in Claggy Holler, where the ground is all sopping wet and muddy,
yes.
I'm going to use my interact with an object action to kick mud at people's faces when I fight them outside, which I think would probably give me advantage on the attack roll. Yes. I don't know.
Yes.
And they'll start doing it back too. They should, You
should suggest it. Like, as a player character, you, like Jesse is pointing out, you should actively be trying to do things to gain advantage. Like, this is one of the things that the Fate system does very, very well, but doesn't really drive home very well. But the idea of using aspects in a scene in order to make it more evocative, swinging across the chandelier, knocking over the bookcase in front of your opponent as the sword fight ensues. Like, these are things you can cover with advantage, disadvantage. Like, you can really just make a combat encounter or any encounter just really pop. Like, imagine a social encounter where you're making rolls and the advantage, disadvantage element is going back and forth based on the momentum of the conversation. Who's gaining the upper hand? Like, who's winning this? Who's backstabbing who in this conversation? Who's got the upper hand? Advantage and disadvantage is your friend here. I got to tell you, didn't Mike Merles invent advantage, disadvantage essentially, or popularize it? He's probably rolling in his grave right now, hearing us talk about it. Sorry, it's just a stupid joke. Yeah. So anyway, great. I think that's a great call out as a mechanic, is advantage, disadvantage for sure.
Yeah, I was reminded of this actually recently in the Dragonlance game when I was like looking at my DM screen, and there's a little table in the thing for weather conditions. So they're like traveling outside to go do these missions like near the front lines of where the armies happen. So I roll them. It's like it's really windy. Like, that's the weather I rolled. It's really windy. Like, so I'm just like, okay, there's a very strong breeze blowing across, Estwild today. So they get in a fight. They're 60 feet away with these hobgoblins. Everybody's like trying to throw javelins so they don't have to do sword work, but everybody's rolling with disadvantage because the wind is just like crazy strong, and it made it more interesting. So
yeah, and use advantage, disadvantage to be a fan of your player characters. If one of your player characters is facing off against that important monster and another one is trying to sneak up behind the monster but fails that roll, so they're not able to come in with that unknown sneak attack or whatever the case may be, but you can still use advantage, disadvantage to be like, well, they heard you coming, but they're shook now. They're like, they've got enemies on both sides. I'm going to go ahead and give them disadvantage or give you advantage on your next attack roll against them as a result. Like, I feel like in our own limited anecdotal experience, I'm often like clutching my pearls when it comes to advantage, disadvantage. Ooh, I can't give the players too much power, even though D&D is ridiculous. It gives you these
between a +2 and a +4 at most. Like,
yeah. D&D is ridiculously in favor of the players as a system, so it's totally okay to be fans of your player characters and toss them a treat.
Cool. Well, this has been really fun to talk about.
Yeah.
Thanks, sure. Jenny.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And any other questions that you as a listener may have for the Jaunty Mantis about this episode, or really any episode, if you have a question for these two curious gamers, Jesse, how can they get that to us?
Shoot us a quick email at jauntymantis@gmail.com.
Perfect. All right. Well, Jesse, thank you so much for joining me for season 1. It feels great to be back in action here.
We have a format again.
And until next time, get out there and play some fucking role-playing games or some shit.
Yeah, play some fucking games or shit. I don't know.
Yeah, whatever.